Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar session, the second webinar series hosted on the PSE platform. My name's Matt Croucher. I'm the EV Services Director at Believe. We're one of the UK's newest and fastest growing charge point operators. This episode today is about deploying EV charge points in your local authority, everything you need to know. So we set ourselves a fairly lofty goal there to be able to tell you everything you need to know. But we've got a brilliant panel of guests today who are invite to join me on the call now. So we've got Rosita Chudasama from who is the Innovative Transport Manager at Nottingham City Council. We've got Tracey Milmore, who is the Senior Zero Emission Vehicle Lead at Transport for the North East. We've got Stephen Mooring, who leads on sustainability from Central Bedfordshire Council. And last but not least, we've got Sean Quirk, who is the Chief Operating Officer from Believe. If we can just begin today, so just to kind of set the scene a bit. So today as I said, we've got a very broad topic to go at, and I think we've got an audience who's going to be really interested to hear the views and experience of the people we've got on our panel today. So some of the topics we'll be covering, I'll run through shortly, and then I'll just ask everyone to go around and provide a bit of an introduction to themselves and your background, how you've got into EV and EV charging, your experience so far, and then we'll get into the topic if that's okay. But just to begin, so this session, as I say, will be covering deploying EV charge points in your local authority, and what we're looking to do is cover everything really that is entailed within that, from identifying what charge point speed is most suitable for a specific area, to accessibility and the planning associated with that, the role of on-street versus off-street charging and site selection, and the need for scalability and future proofing, and how we go about ensuring that the network of charge points that we need is there for the public. So if I can just now hand over to each of you in turn and ask you to provide a bit of background to yourself and how you've got into the EV space and your experience to date, that would be great. Can we start with Rosita?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Rosita Chudasama. So as Matt has said, I'm the Innovative Transport Manager here in Nottingham. Been here for quite a while and sort of fell into electric vehicle stuff, really. Part of the function of the team within the Transport Strategy Service area is to help to develop the local transport plan and other associated strategies, and then develop funding bids. So back in around 2015, I think it was, the government had a fund called Go Ultra Low. And so I basically headed up the funding, and that money really was to help to support the transition to electric vehicles. So really just got into it. I really didn't know much about EVs, and I'll hold my hands up. I'm not like a technical person at the moment either, although I've learned a lot about electric vehicles, and I also run an electric vehicle at home. So I've been driving EV for about 5 years now. So yeah, that's me. Looking forward to
Brilliant.
the questions and having a chat, really.
Brilliant, thanks, Rosita. And I always think it's a good declaration in any kind of EV call to always admit there's stuff you don't know, because nobody knows everything and can know everything. It's a hopelessly broad topic, and I think we've all got our kind of angle and our perspective on it. So yeah, Tracey, would you mind introducing yourself and your background?
Yes, no problem at all. So I'm Tracey Milmore. A lot of people might recognise me from working at Durham Local Authority, where I did work for 23 years, but 4 years in the EV infrastructure before moving over to Transport North East. So my EV journey began in 2019 with EV infrastructure at Durham Local Authority, very rural authority with 40% terraced housing. We started that journey with several broken EV charge points and working on lots of different projects, which I did over 4 years before joining Transport North East. We did a project called the SOSCI project, which was scaling on-street charging infrastructure, and that won the Best EV project at the MG Awards in 2022. So I've done a lot of work on projects for residents without a driveway to charge an EV, and I've installed by the time I'd left her, I'd installed over about 250, 300 EV charge points on numerous different projects. So we had a lot of lessons learned and a lot of project work from that time. We also looked at accessible EV charging as well, and kind of did a mock day on those. On that event, and like I said, we installed on a few different places. I'm now with Transport Northeast. I've been with Transport Northeast for coming up to 8 weeks. We provide strategy and policy information to the Northeast region through the Joint Transport Committee. So I bring into Transport Northeast that kind of local authority on the ground work from installing EV charge points, but now at the strategic policy level where I'm talking and writing policies to support other local authorities, and hope to continue to build the EV infrastructure going towards 2030 and 2035 when the government ban the sale of petrol and diesel cars. So I have a lot of experience of EVs and getting them into the ground and working with inside the local authorities to get that infrastructure built. So hope I can provide
Brilliant.
and help some information today.
Well, a wealth of experience to pick through there, so I'm sure we'll get to cover off some of that in the questions and discussion that follow. So brilliant, thank you for that. Stephen, would you mind going next?
Hi, thanks, Matt. And so my name's Stephen Mooring. I'm head of sustainability at Central Bedfordshire Council. I think compared to Rosita and Tracy, I'm probably a relatively EV newbie. I don't have anywhere near as many years working on EVs. First kind of became involved in leading on this work for the council was part of our sustainability plan, which was adopted in 2020. And then following that, we pulled together our charge point plan, which kind of set out the direction of travel and the approach we wanted to take. That came on board the following year, and that kind of sort of links into what we're now being asked to do for Levi and stuff. So we're going to be looking at that again. That has helped us make some pretty rapid progress with a good team of people here. We've working with a charge point provider, looking at kind of car parks, main sites. We've had a successful Orcs bid. We're also looking at sort of other approaches. So like lots of people, I'm sure, off-street parking and on-street parking are huge issues. So we've done things like we've trialed cable gullies and bits and pieces. So we're taking a sort of all holds bar approach and trying as many different solutions as possible and kind of refining our approach. Challenge we have, unlike kind of Nottingham and Durham, is that Central Bedfordshire is a rural area. So transport is by far our biggest emissions. People really rely on cars. And all our most of our towns are kind of old market towns. So we have those kind of characteristics of an old market town, which make it very challenging.
We like a challenge, don't we? We like a challenge. Brilliant, thank you, Stephen. And last but by no means least, Sean, do you mind tell us a bit about your background?
Hi there, Matt. Yeah, my name's Sean Quirks. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Liberty Charge. I have actually got down here how long I've been in the construction/infrastructure industry, but it's a frightening number actually, so I'm not going to call it out. I've been in it a long time, predominantly with EV though. I started my journey in 2015. So I got approached to join SSE Contracting to support Bolloré. Bolloré were a French company that had bought the TfL network. So that's where we supported them on the end-to-end process. So I built a team that could deliver that, and then moved to Liberty Charge in June 2021. With regards rollout on street and off street, all fast chargers, if I'm honest, and most probably led teams that have installed over around about 3,000 fast sockets sort of in London and sort of some of the surrounding boroughs. So got it.
Brilliant. Brilliant, thank you. So I think hopefully the audience can see there, that's a pretty extensive, a real wealth of experience we've got on the screen there, but various different stages of the process as well, and slightly different angles, which is something that we were keen to try and bring to you. So just before we kind of dive into some of the initial discussion points, I think it'd probably be a good point to run our first poll of the webinar, if that's okay. So we'd be keen to ask the audience, what where you're at in your journey, really. So how far would you say you've progressed in your EV journey so far? So you should all see on screen somewhere to select a range from anywhere between early days, where you've just picked up this role, which you may or may not be pleased about. I think it's a great opportunity, but it's a, it's a tough portfolio as well. Sure, we'll get some reflections on that from the panel. Maybe you've got the ball rolling, you've completed a few initial deployments, and they're just thinking about what comes next. Maybe you're in that kind of difficult middle ground where you've done some of the kind of low-hanging fruit, the initial deployments, and you're finding all sorts of kind of challenges to kind of move beyond that in terms of strategy, consultation, procurement. Maybe you're well underway towards those next stage in the larger scale deployments, and maybe you're an exemplar right at the top who are really leading the way. So just give everyone a few seconds to complete that. We're just keen to get a sense of kind of the nature of the audience, really. I think it's helpful for all our panelists to know to know how to pitch the discussion, really. I think that's probably pretty much settled now, is it? If I click share, or whether the team are going to click, there we go. So hopefully you could now all see that appearing on your screen. I can see it in front of me. So we've got 55%, so just over half of the call are very much at that early days stage, which is entirely what would have expected, to be honest. And that there's people kind of picking up this role relatively recently, and looking around at, okay, where do I start? A bit of background research and looking for good practice. Hopefully you've come to the right place. And then in kind of descending order below that, from got the ball rolling, 18%, 13% on getting there slowly, well underway, 3% exemplar. It'd be great to hear from in the chat the exemplar. Well, from everyone, of course, but yeah, particularly interested as well to learn from your angle there. But brilliant. Okay, well that's really a nice way to kind of get us underway. And so just to kind of dive straight into then the discussion points that we're kind of putting the synopsis for this session. I think the first one is really around what charge point is most suitable, what charge point speed, what charge point type is most suitable for a specific area. So really kind of going back to kind of first principles here of you're starting on your journey. Where do you start? We know we've got a range of different charging solutions. You've got a range of different providers and suppliers, no doubt, wanted to get in touch with you. You've got views, interest been expressed from public, councillors, whoever. How have you approached that as officers in terms of responding to that and determining where do I start? What is the most suitable charge point speed for me to begin with and to focus on particular areas? Rosita, did you want to start on that one?
Yeah, sure. I don't mind kicking it off. I would say, just to dial it back, similar to what Tracy said, actually, it reminded me, we had in Nottingham, we had about 12 charges back in 2016, and not many of them worked, and not many of them being maintained. So a really kind of obsolete network, well, you couldn't actually call it a network, just like a hodgepodge of charge points across the city, linked to precursor funding through Plugged In Midlands, or that Plugged In Places fund that was around a couple of years ago. So when we started, we very much recognised through talking to different stakeholders. So one of the first things that I did was reach out to colleagues within the council, reach out to stakeholders, partners, major businesses, that type of thing, and actually talked about electric vehicles. And the number one feedback was, well, if you want me to have confidence in driving electric, I need the infrastructure. I need to be able to see it. It needs to be visible, accessible, and that type of thing. So we knew we needed an infrastructure network. And I suppose that kind of refinement in terms of what charger do you put where came later, because really the focus for us was we need to do a procurement because we don't have a charge point operator. So we needed to do that. We tried to look at some of the land assets that we've got in terms of where should we place them, and then sort of lent on some of the sort of, not like academic research, but some of the evidence that's out there in terms of right charge point, right place, in terms of like, slow charges being more for residential and rapid charges or higher power charges being for more on the go and in motorway services and that type of stuff. So we tried to sort of use that framework, although I would say that in practice, what has happened is, for instance, to kind of make it a more tangible example, we've got a park and ride site, which obviously prior to COVID, people would drive in the morning from neighbouring cities elsewhere in order to access employment here, leave their vehicles on in the park and ride for 7 hours a day, which was the optimum time for them to be on charge. So our strategy, if you like, was to do slower power charging in those types of locations. However, due to historic reasons, we had a rapid charger at one of these park and rides, and we thought with this new funding, let's just replace it and keep it there because we've got the power connection, all of the works have been done. We just need to put a new unit on top. We did that, and that ended up being one of the most popular rapid charge point locations that we had in the whole city, even though it was in a park and ride. And that's kind of curious, right? It doesn't really kind of play into a park and ride, long stay sort of, at location, rapid charges, 10 minutes, half an hour, and you're off again. However, that park and ride was quite close to the strategic road network, major employment sites, hospitals, that type of thing. So actually, people could just come in, use the facility and go again. So sometimes it gets a bit nuanced in terms of putting the right charger in the right place. And I certainly don't, I'm not an expert in it, but we've had to kind of play with where have we got a site, how much power can we get to that site, and how can we maximize the funding? Therefore, how many units can we actually deliver? And sometimes we've kind of thrown the rule book out the window and just gone with, what we think. So it's been a bit of an art in terms of like, this is what we think might work, and then use the utilization information to then learn from it to then refine the approach for future sites.
Interesting. So yeah, a bit of a kind of suck it and see approach in terms of, okay, so there's some opportunities here. We'll go with that. We'll monitor it. We'll learn, and we'll create a bit of a feedback loop for future ones, as well as a kind of data plan-led approach, but in moderation. Yeah.
Because if you start from nothing, you kind of have there's no information, there's no data, isn't it? So you kind of need something, and it's something better than nothing, rather than kind of getting stuck on, I need to make exactly the right decision, and being paralyzed sometimes in knowing what is the right decision. Whereas I suppose we've had the luxury of having the funding to sort of experiment a little bit and then learn through doing some of the locations, and then having the data sort of rolling in terms of, like for Nottingham, over 400 locations, or 400 charge points, across the sub-region. But the rapid chargers are by far the most popular, even though the majority of the units that we've got out are actually the 7 to the 22 kilowatt units. So actually, right charger, right place, or is it convenience and preference for in terms of behaviours of the customers? It's all still kind of, they're still chewing it over, really.
Learning by doing, and kind of reflecting that in the future plans. I mean, Tracey, it'd be interesting to kind of get your take from the experience you kind of outlined at the beginning in terms of what you've been involved with. What are the reasons from your perspective and experience around installing different speeds of charge points in different locations? How do you approach that, and has it changed? I think you might be on mute, sorry.
Am I unmuted?
Oh, yeah, you're unmuted.
I'm unmuted. Good. I think one thing to say straight away is that every site is different. No sites are all the same. And even if you pick two park and rides, which are both park and rides, both of them sites aren't the same, and each site has to have kind of that analysing of what suits best at each particular site. From the EV charge points that I've installed so far, hands up, majority has been the 7 to 22s fast. Reason for that is because of you could say you would get 2 or 3 fast chargers in for the cost of one rapid. And sometimes I think at the time we're at, it's important to build that infrastructure and have that infrastructure available, because you've got to think that, you know, some people, it's a different take on your journey as an EV driver. You know, it's different to petrol. You don't have to fill up that full tank to get to your next destination. You may only need half an hour charge, you may need an hour charge. It depends on what the person's plans are and what are they doing. So, but it's also thinking about what is at that site and how long are you likely to stay for. So when you go to that site, are you near a shopping centre? Would you be likely to stay for an hour, 2 hours? If so, then you could get your 7 to 22 in. If you're likely to only stay for 10 minutes and get a coffee, then a Rapids is perfect. However, if it's near where you're sleeping overnight, then you would think your slow charger, because you can just plug it in overnight. But it's also thinking about the turnover of that particular car park and that area as well. You know, you could potentially stay in that car park for 3 to 4 hours, but is it an extremely busy car park that you would rather the flow of traffic flowed through that quicker and you got a rapid charger in there for half an hour and then left that parking space and that allowed another car to come in? It's really, each site I think needs that whole mixture and that whole development, which I think for EV hubs is a great idea, where you could put potentially one rapid and one fast charger next to each other. Then you've got the site of them both. So it's just keeping those options open, and you know, and if you can get passive infrastructure in there to develop that for future proofing, and make more charging available as time progresses with the people buying EV vehicles, and get that target on correctly, then that works. But I don't think there's any answer. You can't point out, say, you know, roughly, if it's near a motorway or a service station, yes, the Rapids are going to fit best. If it's near residential home, you're looking at your slower 3 to 7 kilowatt charges, because overnights. But really, each area needs a survey in itself to tell you what would suit that area, and sometimes it's just testing and seeing what works, and taking that feedback from the stakeholders, from the residents and the visitors, and what those charging patterns are. Are they busy all the time, and do you need to put more charge points in, or are they less? You know, are people getting longer charges there? It's a working out and testing the market to see, which I think, you know, Levi Pilot's got a lot of things out to test the works at this moment in time. So I think it's testing the areas at the moment and seeing what works best.
Brilliant, thanks, Tracy. Yeah, it's probably fair to say it's the market, the charging landscape is evolving before our eyes, isn't it? You know, the vehicles are changing and evolving as new generation of vehicles come online. Similarly with the chargers and the technology, you both mentioned about inheriting some not too reliable initial kind of first generation charger kit, which had its challenges, and in amongst that, the landscape of charging changes, doesn't it? So a charger that might be well utilized one day. Yeah,
the larger batteries, as soon as the batteries come out in that larger range, you won't need that charge to potentially get us further. So that's a consideration to take in as well.
Yeah, it's fair to say there's a lot of moving parts. Ironically, unlike an EV, but it makes planning interesting. Yeah. Stephen, it'd be great to get your take on kind of, you know, how you've approached selecting the right charge speed for the right area, and maybe how kind of moving on to the on-street versus off-street. And I don't really like to pitch it as a binary thing. It's certainly not, but you know, maybe your take on how you've approached your initial deployments.
So when we started working on this and looking at this, it's probably fair to say we were starting from a very low bar, which, you know, on to some extent was kind of a okay position for me to be in, because just getting anything anywhere was an improvement to where we are. You know, our previous charge points we'd installed were sort of 10, 12 years old and probably spent more time not working than they did working. So they're a bit of a pain. We kind of set about it by sort of trying to build an evidence base to understand actually where demand was, what, you know, we had to aim for. So one of the first things we did was we set up a kind of a register of interest, a sort of an online map, which is still on our website now, where residents can drop a pin to say, yeah, actually I live in this area and I would like a charge point at some point, or I'm thinking about getting an electric car, and that's got a whole host of other questions, which has provided us with really useful information. And that's provided us mapping, which has been amazing for kind of funding bids for orgs and things. You know, it really helps us demonstrate that where there's demand. We also worked with consultants to look at sort of projections going forward. So we looked at sort of demographics of the central Bedfordshire area, you know, made some assumptions on who are likely to be early adopters and what, you know, by postcode, what areas are likely to be earlier adopters. We looked at main transport routes going through our area. That's also one thing Central Bedshire's got is, you know, amazing road routes going through. So A1, M1, other roads like that. And then we also looked at kind of main kind of attractors. So car parks in the middle of towns and other sorts of destinations, and kind of broadly, you know, if it's residential areas, so it's saying, well, it should be fast or you know, 22 kilowatt or below, so largely sort of 7 kilowatt, and tend to be pushing down the sort of Yorks funded type route to deliver those. For the sort of anything quicker than that, sort of rapid, ultra rapid, we sort of looked to the market really and work with charge point providers to provide, given that they require more in terms of investment. And you know, actually one thing that we do have as a council is land, and we have car parks in really strategically, you know, land in good locations and things. So we're open to have that discussion. And then you kind of throw on top of that issues like grid capacity, grid connection costs and things, which, you know, ultimately means that, you know, I think for our first round of work, we looked at about 200 different sites, but only 10 came forward because, you know, they were either too difficult in terms of costs or there just wasn't capacity to do. So, you know, it's for best will in the world, we might not necessarily get what we want where we want anyway, and that's a big thing that we wrestle with. On the issue of sort of on-street versus off-street, obviously the mapping that I sort of explained earlier, that's how to show us demand. We've also done a lot of work in just kind of making sure that we have good mapping, so we know where there is parking, where there isn't residential parking, where there are, you know, and where do people who don't have their own private parking, where do they park their cars, and understand sort of land ownership and where we as a council are able to kind of intervene there. So we put a few sort of charging hubs in that way. Also recognise that actually, you know, I've had emails from residents who we've put a charging hub literally at the end of the road, you know, 2-minute walk, and they're wanting to have permission to run cables across the pathway in front of their house, and we're saying, oh no, but you've got a charging hub there. So, you know, we recognise that people will want to charge from home because it's cheaper. So we've done things looking at, like I mentioned earlier, sort of cable gullies. We've done a pilot of that, which was really interesting. Actually, the initial response to it, I think it was really Marmite. People either thought it was a brilliant idea or thought we were bonkers, but we learned an awful lot from that, and we're going to be trialing another product later this year, hopefully. So a lot of learning on that, and that kind of really suits the nature of our area. But I think the one thing I've learned is that there's just no single solution, single answer. If only it were that simple.
Yeah, I think that's a good conclusion to draw. And as Tracey said, you know, every site's different, isn't it? There's such a unique set of characteristics for every street, every car park. You know, the nature of the use that does tend to point in various different directions. Just to kind of continue the role of on-street charging and the options there. Sean, you're a man who knows a bit about on-street charging. Would you mind telling us a bit about your experience there and your views on the part that plays as part of the overall kind of ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, for me, obviously, as I said earlier, most of my life has actually been spent in the fast world of EV. So, I mean, up until last year, as believed, we were sort of really just playing in that fast market. Now, obviously, yeah, more challenges because actually we're sort of looking from that whole range, from sort of lamppost chargers up to ultras, and looking for suitable sites. You know, the journey started off as Tracy and that said. I mean, it is literally no site's the same, but also as well, no local authority and no set of residents are the same. I mean, one of the things that I've always sort of stated is sort of working on the Source London project. I worked with 24 of the London local authorities and worked most probably 24 different ways with 24 different thought processes on how to roll this out. So there is no exact science. Yeah, I mean, there is as a, you know, from my journey, the business that we've sort of done with the fast chargers, it was quite a, you know, an in-depth thing of actually looking at suitable areas. You know, key is DNO maps. You know, making sure that you got suitable power. I mean, one of the things that we've tried to avoid is actually putting charge points outside people's houses. I think that then, you know, it does create that bit where they feel that the charge point then is actually their personal charge point if they've got an EV. So as a rule, we try to look at more towards the end of the roads. And one of the things that I've found now, one of the things that seems to be of interest and will cause some more challenges is actually sort of looking at the on-street rapid. I think we're fine up to sort of 50 kilowatt DC. I think once you start looking at that, I think then you've got to move to the off-street model purely because of the size of the feeder pillars. You know, just trying to get through a charge point through planning will have its challenges. If you're then going to put a 2 meter by 2 meter feeder pillar alongside it, that's going to create some more. With the off-street, Matt, one of the things that we did have some challenges around was, you know, installing feeder pillars and the DNO connection. What we were quite lucky with in working in London local authorities is that they actually owned the car parks and the highways. So where you get that situation, we were able to sort of put the feeder pillar, etc., on the highway, and then actually run the cables and everything into the charge points, in which, you know, we've had some challenges outside London where it's been a county council and a district council when, you know, trying to site the feeder pillar and then trying to get way leave agreements signed adds a little bit more challenge. But yeah, with the speed, again, more of that residential for fast chargers and the sort of slower chargers. And yeah, what we've been looking at is just coming off the main roads for trying to install the on-street rapids. Obviously, they're sort of, you're looking at 1.6 to 2 meters high. You know, very conscious that you know you're not trying to sort of impact the street scene and impact people's sort of view, etc. But yeah, I mean, there is a number of challenges, but as I say, it's just trying to find that right speed.
Brilliant. A few in kind of knowing nods from some of the bits you were talking through there, Sean. Kind of shared experience and pain amongst the group at times, I suspect. Just moving to the kind of next item we had on our kind of 5 topic points. And by the way, if people do want to ask questions generally or to any specific panelists, do feel free to stick a question in the live chat there. We will try and get to those towards the kind of last quarter or last third of the session. So the offer's there if people want to ask questions. But question around accessibility. So something that is it was often maybe overlooked or wasn't given the consideration it should have been in the first wave of charge point deployments, where I think probably fair to say people were battling with some of the more fundamentals around getting these in. Now, pleased to say there is a lot more focus rightly around making sure that these charge points are accessible and inclusive. Tracey, I think you've done quite a lot of work in this area. It'd be great to get your views on that and how you're approaching that. Oh, I think you're on mute again.
Working? Can
You're
you hear me
working.
now?
You're on.
Working? Good,
Yes.
good. So when I worked at Durham, we did a day in the very early stages because we got asked this question a lot about, are these charge points accessible? And I think my first naive thought was, well, of course they are. The charge points are always nearer the building. So of course they're going to be accessible. And that is definitely not the case, because we held a mock day where we put up a charge point, and we asked some disabled drivers to come along and use this charge points and show us how the ease of use was. So we put up a mock charge point at a lower height. We made the charge point kind of bigger parking space around all of the edges of the car, and we got lots of questionnaires and lots of feedback about the ease of use. I mean, things like the writing on the screen and how some people couldn't read the writing on the screen, the size of the cables and carrying that weight and the amount of cabling to the charge points to get those plugged in. These are all bits of information that you don't really consider, and that needs to be considered with EV charging. There is some guidelines out now called PAS 1899, which they're not compulsory in yet for every local authority or every charge point operator to use, but there is careful consideration on trying to put those guidelines in when you're installing EV charge points. It is really hard to do as a local authority, but it's something that I think when you go to every site and you think about putting that charge point in, I think it's something to consider to see whether you can make that charge point accessible. Like I say, the spacing around the charge point, if you're making a charge point accessible, you would go to probably a car parking space of 3 down to 2 with an EV charge point in that's accessible. So immediately, you are losing a car parking space or taking out a car parking space from that car park. Again, another point to consider is if you are marking that bay in as being accessible, disabled EV drivers only, then that limits that EV charge point to only accessible drivers that can use it. So my way going forward at this moment in time is, if we can get a charge point bay in that is accessible and is that right sizing, then we future-proof it and we put that in. We maybe at this moment in time don't completely mark it up for the sole use of accessible drivers, but it is there and available for them to use, as well as open for others to use. But I think the idea is to try and future-proof and get that sizing in car parks as and where you can. Really difficult to do if a car park is, for example, only 5 to 6 bays as it is, only because you were looking at then taking that car park down to 4 or 5, and is that car park big enough? We would then have to look at a closer site that we could do an accessible EV charging bay in closer and try and make those available. But as we look to the future, in 2030, the government are banning the sale of petrol and diesel cars. One thing to consider is mobility cars. Those type of mobility cars, every 3 years, they generally get a new car, which therefore, if they get new cars, they can only get the electric vehicle new cars. So those drivers are going to need them when that time comes as well. So it's just trying to kind of make those considerations and put those into future-proof and get as many people prepared and ready for them as we can. But I definitely don't think it's something that we can ignore. I think as we've got to look at each site when we're installing each charge point, go through that criteria list and see whether we can install that accessible. And by no means there should be no excuses if we can install an accessible EV charge point bay in a car park, or with that correct widening and with that level of charge point and making it easier for everybody to use. We should ultimately be putting those in and doing them as and when we can.
Completely agree. Yeah, it'd be interesting. Any other views from our panel on the question around accessibility and inclusivity of charge point deployment, bay design, user functionality, and interested in, I guess, your experience on that? Yeah, go for it, Steve.
I think a similar story in that we absolutely haven't got it right so far, but we have learned a lot. I think that the PAS standard is really helpful, and that will be written into anything that we do going forward. I think there's definitely scope to be clever about if we're looking at bay, say like in market squares and things, kind of making the end bay where you effectively have 2 sides accessible, an EV charge point. But it is a real challenge. I think probably the other part of that which Tracey touched on, is around enforcement, and whether you designate it as being an accessible disabled bay, or whether you just do it with more space, and that is, I think, probably something we're looking at on almost by case basis.
Yeah, you end up back to that point of no site's quite the same. There are differing constraints, different opportunities to do more or less at some sites rather than others. Yeah. But we've got a few questions I'm keen to get to. So just moving on to the last couple of points of our initial kind of discussion points then was around site selection, scalability, and future proofing. So as per build, these are big topics in their own right. You could do a whole webinar each of those things alone. I mean, on the site selection piece, and I guess around how you look to make sure you achieve that kind of good geographic spread in your deployment, whilst also unlocking a good amount of private sector investment and use of grants and so on. Who would be able to kind of tell us a bit about how you've approached that and what your considerations have been to getting that balance between levering in some investment, getting a good spread of charges and so on?
Quite happy to go with this one, Matt.
Go for it, Sean.
So if I'm really honest, very early days was working with the local authority. I mean, although I know how to install infrastructure, I don't know the lie of the land with regards residents. So it was very much working hand in hand, but it was very much old school. So it was very much around using Google Maps and having access to the DNO maps and trying to marry the both up to make sure that you had a suitable site. So that was very early days. And there's still a certain amount of that goes on. And again, it is working with, for me, it's been working with officers has allowed sort of both Source London and Believe's network to grow. We then move sort of more into a bit. So we have actually then started to get the geospatial tool that actually gives a lot of guidance, has been a great help. And then, but again, it's still that same process of, using the tool, using data from the SMMT, and then just trying to create that network. And one of the things as well that we've also do is to actually try and make sure there's the spread of charge points, as in, we try to make sure that in a lot of the local authorities, there's been a number of sites within each ward, so that there is a general spread of the charge points as well. But yeah, I mean, site selection has been very much driven in different ways from residents' requests as well. Again, going back in the day, we had Charge My Street, which again was thousands of pins being dropped on maps to help that site selection. And again, as I say, I don't think there's a one fits all really. It's a different.
Definitely. It's a challenging one, isn't it? And again, requires a bit of a kind of tailored approach depending on the nature of the local authority area, I suppose. And Rosita, just maybe building on that, on the point of scalability and the challenges of moving on, I guess, from the initial deployment of some charges in the first sites to really then scaling up that deployment and the challenges of what maybe that means in terms of the look and impact of that. Is there anything you'd like to kind of cover around that?
Yeah, I mean, just to build on what Sean was saying, because I think site selection is the whole sector, this is really challenging. I think if you're starting out in this, you just, everywhere you turn, you think, oh, this is a problem. I don't know what I'm doing. It's really, really hard. It's really hard. So I do sympathize. And, 7 years on, it's still really hard. Even in Nottingham, we've got 160 charge points. I'd say probably 145 of those actual units themselves are located off street. We've done it off street for a reason, because Onstreet is just fraught with challenges that we just can't see a way through. Even now, today, sitting here, honestly, how do you get over the parking management? What do you do about the maintenance and liability? All of the accessibility stuff that Tracey mentioned, not just from an EV driver perspective who's in a wheelchair or has got some other disabilities and they need access to the unit, but what about mothers with buggies or fathers with prams and wheelchair users on the footpath. There's like a whole gamut of stuff. You're trying to think from a position, you know, of everybody's requirements and trying to find room in an area that's already congested if you work in an urban city, to kind of make room for something brand new, a new facility. So it is really hard. I suppose we started with, I mean, we kind of joked about it at the start, but our mantra was like work with the willing. So we kind of started with partners in areas where we could actually like do something, that people were receptive and you know, willing to participate in this. So, you know, looking at your own local authority stock, like parking stock, you know, we had the luxury of having park and rides, car parks that we own, leisure centres that we own, library car parks, you know, that type of thing. They're kind of locations like that are off street, where the battles may be not as difficult to have in order to negotiate creating a few bays. Could you start there? Could you do, you know, could you follow like a mixed hub model, or even if it was just all like, you know, slow charges, because I know that's partly the focus of Levi. But, you know, keep it off street to some degree in residential areas like district car parks, for instance. There's got to be like pockets of area of land that the local authority will own. So, you know, speaking to your legal colleagues, property colleagues, you know, facilities people, it's about building those kind of networks internally to see how you can kind of explore it. But it is an uphill battle, because nobody will want to release the land. You know, we've had all sorts of objections from people saying, well, this land is more viable for, you know, for a mixed use development, or we're going to sell the land off, or we don't just put these charges in, or why are you even doing this? You should be promoting, you know, sustainable transport, getting people out of their cars. So yeah, every type of argument, you name it, I've had it. And site selection is where the tension is, because you know, you want that space really, and there might be competing demands for that space. If you can, maybe talk to your local DNO as well, because I mean, again, not that we've had like major success in this area, but they will know where there is capacity or residual capacity on their network, on their kind of energy network. So rather than kind of guessing, could we not have that kind of, you know, that data stream that's coming in that says, well, actually, if you made a connection in this area of the city or this area of your town or wherever, it would actually be really cheap for you to deploy charge points in that location. And if you know that, I'm not saying just follow those easy wins, but if you know that, then you kind of have more of an understanding for your financial management to then be able to offset some of the more expensive areas where there is a lack of power, in order to try and get some sense of scale or volume, or trade off, quite honestly, because I think commercial providers will want to follow where it's commercially viable to put in charge points, where they're going to get, you know, make the most money. But ultimately, from an authority perspective, you're trying to look at, you know, like equity across the spectrum, isn't it? So we want charge points in more deprived areas because that's the right thing to do. But those households may not necessarily go EV earlier than other areas because the cost of vehicles and other, you know, other barriers. That's not to say we shouldn't do it. So how do we sort of find that balance? How do we create that kind of mutual, common sort of partnership with, you know, with the provider? So I'm rambling a little bit, but there's like hopefully a few kind of takeaways within that. So yeah, definitely start with looking at the land that you own, see if you can get connections through the DNOs. And I think the things that the other panel members have said about engage with local people, you know, try and find out where is their demand, because, you know, you're probably going to have a network of EV drivers already that probably may feel like they don't have a voice. And so, you know, having some kind of, whether it's an online form or starting some sort of forum where people can start to feed back, suddenly you'll get a whole load of like input that might help you in terms of designing and planning what you do next.
Brilliant, thank you. Not rambling at all. I think that was a really brilliant summary, to be honest, of some of the dilemmas that no doubt everyone on the call is grappling with around how you kind of strike that balance between achieving a good coverage, recognizing that there's probably more demand in certain areas, but that, you know, you want to provide that equitable access to charging as well. Does anyone else want to come in on that point before we move over to kind of answering some of the questions that have come in? Yeah, go for it, Stephen.
Just very quickly, I think yeah, I agree with all that. I think the other thing that is probably a bit more tricky to get a handle on is what's the private sector doing. So places like supermarkets, charging stations and things, are getting to understand what their plans are with regards to kind of EV charge point rollout is really tricky, because they don't particularly want to talk to local authorities, the big supermarkets and things, and that that is part of a consideration to have. I know in the work we did, where we're kind of trying to say, well, what figure do we need to aim for by 2030? That the advice we had was, it is X amount, but actually 50% of that is likely to be delivered by the private sector, and that's where things like planning guidance and that whole side of things becomes really important. So if anyone is wanting to build a new supermarket in central Bedfordshire, they sure as hell are going to have to deliver in terms of kind of EV charge point as well, which they sort of have to with building regs, but we're trying to push that as far as we can, and have that passive provision to grow.
It's a really good way to unlock additional charge points, isn't it? And new developments going in this day and age without any kind of provision seems kind of crazy, because the retrofit cost of doing that down the line is so much more than doing it as part of the initial deployment. We've got some really good questions coming in on the chat, so I'll just start kind of picking off a few of these and seeing if we can help answer some of these. Any we don't get time to cover in the call, by the way, we will try and get back to you separately afterwards. Apologies, we're not going to be able to cover everything. So a question here from Brian Black. Read the commercials. Does the LA use its own capital to pay for the installation of the chargers, or it's given to a third-party company that funds the chargers and takes the revenue? So this was one of our discussion points that we didn't get to around business models. Might be quite interesting to get some kind of views from the panel on that. We've touched on some of these points, but as to a kind of public funded, part public, part private, or fully private funded approach, what's been your approach to that so far, and going forwards, what do you think the roles to play are? Who wants to pick that up? So, go on, Sean.
Well, I can speak from a CPO perspective. I mean, obviously, as Believe, we're quite happy to fully fund the whole rollout of the network, but also as well quite happy to work with local authorities, etc., to sort of get funding. Especially with the Levi funding. I know currently at the moment, from especially from my side, I think there's a number of challenges with sort of the Levi fund, and it potentially sort of impacting the rollout. I think ideally, if it could have moved a bit quicker, I think we'd be a bit more advanced stage on number of sockets. But from our side of it, and for both companies that I've worked for, it's very, very much been that we are able to fully fund that solution, which obviously then takes away the pain of actually trying to then go down the route of trying to gain sort of funding from central government.
Bro, did anyone else want to come in on that, or should I go on to the next question? Yeah, go on, Steve.
I think effectively where there has been kind of funding from the council has been via grant, so that's been our sort of public funding towards it, and where we do that, we look for profit share. I think ultimately, though, we recognise that we're not the best placed people to run and operate a charge point network, and that's where charge point operators are really, really key. So anything that we can do to secure that investment in, even if we're just effectively leasing parking spaces for them to make use of, then they are able to make sure they keep on top of maintenance and the whole customer service side of things. I think if we were going to do that in-house, I'd need a whole new team of people, and just focusing on that. So I think let the charge point providers do what they're good at, and don't
Brilliant.
try and reinvent the wheel.
Go on, Sean. Yeah.
Can I just come back on just a quick point on that? So obviously when we're installing fully funded, we do actually offer bay fees for that. So yeah, it isn't just a case of we want the land off you and then sort of walk away and take all the profits. So there is usually a scheme fee or bay fee that we pay. And you are right, because one of the things I hear are sort of whispers around, and it's is around sort of maybe local authorities and etc. wanting to own and operate a network. I mean, one of the things I think you've all mentioned where you've taken over networks previously owned and found the pains of it. I mean, one of the things that I found, and I was quite surprised, I mean, people who will have different opinions on TfL, they do run quite a large tube network pretty successfully, so there must be some good. But, when Bolloré bought the TfL Source London network, again, I think the pain was similar to yourselves, and a number of those charge points were down with issues. So, yeah, I mean, I do agree with, what you say there, Stephen, around leaving the people, the CPOs to actually support you and actually provide a service for your residents and that,
Okay, just on the next question, and the question we've had the most votes for people who are kind of keen to know the answer was from Rupert Bryce. What's the best source of independent advice on EV chargers, installation, maintenance, websites, etc., please? What are your go-to sources for either evidence to support strategies or kind of more general advice around charge point deployment, procurement, etc.?
I think somebody put it in the chat, but I think the Nevis stuff. So when we started out, certainly we had some technical support provided by Cenex. Now I know Cenex are one of the kind of 1/3 of the Levi support body, so I probably get in touch with the support body. I think the lead is Energy Savings Trust, to see how they can provide support or signposting to resources. One of the things that we're doing in the Midlands area, and I don't know how it's set up elsewhere, is specifically for Levi's. We're kind of joining forces with our neighbouring authorities and forming a bit of a voluntary consortium, so we can kind of learn together. And so maybe that's an opportunity, because again, people are at different stages. People have got like different resource capacities within their organisation, so having that opportunity to kind of learn from one another. Midlands Connect themselves have got resource that are appointed and dedicated on this, so we kind of benefit from their expertise and feedback and kind of coordination work as well. So I'll definitely start there. But I think, and talk to charge point operators. There's some in the room here. Obviously, there's others that are also available, and they're out there. They'll be more than willing to talk to you, and they'll probably promise you everything. And so it's kind of getting educated on what are the different business models, what are the different types of charge point providers, what are their strengths and weaknesses. So you kind of become like more of an intelligent client with respect to this, because they're not all made equal, and ultimately it's up to you what you want, who you want to go with, following whatever tendering process you want to create for yourselves. But yeah, talk to charge point, just talk to as many people as you can do, because there's one thing about reading stuff, but actually going out, seeing stuff, like London's London, isn't it? We all look to London sometimes. TfL have got some really good stuff on their website as well. I think it's very old, but even a charge point installation guide that they produce that's got some really interesting graphics in there that things like earthing requirements that you need to factor in, which is like touch distances between different electrical infrastructure that you need to factor in. So yeah, I'd say just try and talk to anybody that's willing to help you and learn in that manner, and forge a little network, a little community for yourselves, whether it's your peer local authorities or other councils that share similar goals or similar challenges.
I could completely just reinforce that whole networking point. I think the working in conjunction with the likes of Midlands Connect in local consortiums is a really nice approach. For sessions like today, just sharing knowledge and best practice can be quite cathartic for a start, but it's also, you do learn always, even if you've been in the industry a long time, through speaking to peers. And so there are people who will generously kind of give their time. And so, yeah, we will follow up to the questions that are coming in, to those we don't get to. And I'm sure people on the call would be happy to kind of speak offline as well. Just in terms of the next question we've had come in, Tom Ronan has kind of put up the challenge for the next session. So previously worked at a council, but now working at a housing authority where there are even more moving parts. Would you consider putting on a webinar for housing associations / registered providers? I think that's a great idea. We'll speak to the webinar organisers afterwards on that one. I can certainly appreciate the challenges you might face there. We've had a specific request here from Graham Allen to give some steer on. So small parish council near an A road, community centre car park. So parking available mostly, 3-phase power already installed, some solar power, mix of on-road parking. What mix of power outs, I mean, it means probably charging outlets, types of chargers would we recommend for that type of site? Who wants to go on that? Parish council, community centre near an A road.
Quite happy because we're actually about to install one pretty soon. So we're actually putting in a mix. It's very similar by the sounds of it, because this parish council has actually got it's a brand new building, solar power, etc. Now the idea is I believe they use it as some sort of silver command centre. So we are actually putting a 50 kilowatt rapid in, but also fast chargers. We're putting a number of fast chargers. The dwell time there for most people when they go to the centre is around 2 or 3 hours. So yeah, we're rolling out a number of fast with one rapid 150 kilowatt DC.
Good stuff. There you go. You've got a template answer there. Okay. In terms of time, I think we've got 4 minutes left, which doesn't look right to me, but okay, it says we've got 4 minutes, so I'll carry on. So a question from David Dundas says, should all public charge point operators be required by law to offer payment by credit card? So this has been a bit of a hot topic for some time. There have been some developments in this space. Again, be interested to get the views of our panelists on that.
I can happily come in if you want as well. Either or.
Yeah,
we'll go on, Tracy. Yeah, so I'm not sure who's first. So go on, Tracy.
Okay, so with contactless terminals, there isn't until now. Levi are suggesting, and there's going to be a rule brought out, I think, by next year, that all charge points above 7.1 need to have that contactless terminal on. It's really difficult for a local authority to consider and put these on, especially because the local authority are mainly putting charge points probably in less commercial places. So commercial places as in near housing and kind of in your rural or your urban areas where money is quite tight. And obviously with the gas and electric prices of things, we're trying to keep the tariffs of charge point as low and make them like kind of accessible for those drivers to use. As soon as we put a terminal on those charge points, there's a charge for that terminal, which is something like, I think it's something like £5 a month or £5 per a plug socket. I'm not exactly sure, but as soon as we put that terminal on, that charge has to go into our costs of things, which may affect the cost of a charge point per kilowatt hour as to what the resident pays. So it's really difficult because, I mean, when I started my EV journey, we used to pay kind of about 35 pence for a fast charger per kilowatt hour. I think we're now up to an average of around 60 pence public wise. And you know, we are trying to encourage drivers to go from petrol, diesel to electric. And one of that encouragement ways is the cost and the ease of use and the accessibility. And as soon as you put that cost on, and obviously putting the terminal on, it's easier, yes, to just put your card against the charge point and use and pay for your charge in that way, but it will affect the cost of your amount per charge point that you're paying. So that's why at this moment in time we've still settled with the apps and that one's going forward, but ultimately we will have to consider that contactless terminal. I know like the Levi funding criteria are wanting us to push that way and use that way, so it is something we will need to bring into and put on our charge points. But I think residents and EV users will have to be prepared to maybe take a hit with the cost of that, because it's inevitable that we won't be able to keep the usage of the electric down for that. So it's
Brilliant. Thank you.
considerations all
Thank you.
round.
Like many things in EV, it's always more nuanced than it may appear, and yeah, there's a clear kind of advantage to it, but that there are some challenges around cost as well, and it kind of unintended consequences on impacting on deployment. So yeah, very good question. I'm sorry we didn't get time to answer all of your questions. As I say, we will try and get back to you after the session, but thank you very much to our panelists today for a really engaging conversation. I think we covered a lot of ground there. Hopefully lived up to the very broad title we'd set ourselves at the start. If we can just run our final poll of the day, which was really just to kind of partly address some of the questions we've had and not had a chance to answer. If anyone would like a follow-up one-on-one with any of the Believe team to cover some ground that we haven't had a chance to cover today, or kind of dig into any further questions, please do let us know in that the live poll, and that gives us a chance then to follow up with you afterwards. So I think that poll should be open now. Oh yeah, I can see that's running. So yeah, anyone who wants us to reach out afterwards, please let us know. But otherwise, thank you very much again to our panelists. Hope you've all enjoyed the session, and we hope to see you on the next.